Welcome to Race and Diplomacy. My name is Judd Devermont.
My name is Travis Adkins. In this video series, we'll explore the moment of our racial reckoning and all that it means for international diplomacy and foreign affairs.
We'll engage with U.S., African, global activists. We'll talk to journalists, educators, diplomats, and we'll talk to you about how to change mindsets, processes, and practices at home and abroad.
In today's inaugural episode, we feature Patrick Gathara, a Kenyan journalist, Moki Makura, the Executive Director of Africa No Filter and a Nigerian living in South Africa, and Thandikile Moyo, a writer from Zimbabwe. Judd, I thought this episode was absolutely amazing. For us to be able to witness an exchange from people from three different regions of the continent, and for them to explore not only what it means in terms of Black Lives Matter and civic protests from their national perspectives, but also regionally, to hear their voices on what is happening in the United States, and really to hear their broader reflections about what this moment of civil protests of people from the African diaspora all over the world means to each one of them. What do you think?
Yeah, I really thought that there was so many useful insights about how we talk about Africa, how we talk about specific challenges in a country like Nigeria or Zimbabwe or Kenya. How do we make sure that the narrative is multifaceted, right? There is no single story. And I think it's a challenge for those of us whose job is to communicate to a general US audience. That balance between being specific, but also being able to communicate it to a much larger audience. I thought they put some real important markers down about how we have to think about the challenges and opportunities the continent faces. Where are we now in mid-August in terms of what that meme and hashtag and message means in your lives and in your communities? Moki, I know you've thought a lot about this.
At the time when it sort of took on a life of its own again, I think Black Lives Matter, I think, particularly resonated. I think on the continent, particularly I saw around young people. And I sort of started an article that I wrote in CNN about a Gen Zer, I think she's about 20, a friend's daughter, who really took to it. And her and all her friends just seemed to get really engaged in, I guess, what I saw as more of an American issue. So if I look at it today, what I feel has happened is that Black Lives Matter has become much bigger, in that it's sort of become the symbol for anybody who feels oppressed or feels there should be a movement.
I think in Kenya, there was a bit of resentment at the beginning because you had a demonstration outside the US Embassy about George Floyd, and people were asking, well, why aren't you demonstrating about Kenyans who were killed by Kenyan cops? You know, so I think there was a sense in which people sort of identify and understand what the protests in the US were about, but were afraid that their own struggles were going to be erased and it's all going to be framed around what's happening elsewhere rather than being brought home to what's happening here.
I think that's what's really interesting about Thandikile's experience, where the hashtag has been appropriated as Zimbabwe Lives Matter. And do you feel like you're in control of that message? I mean, how much do you feel like you're in a dialogue with the larger Black Lives Matter?
In Zimbabwe, the fascinating thing with Black Lives Matter is that when that George Floyd thing first happened, the government jumped onto it. Our government is an oppressive, repressive government. So when it happened, they jumped onto it, and it was like to them, look, I mean, you guys are always talking about police brutality and all those things. And America always takes this whole, we're a democratic country stance. Look what's happening in America. And they jumped, it's the government that first jumped on Black Lives Matter. And they adopted the "we can't breathe" tag, you know, as a counter to us saying you need to stop this repressive and oppressive behavior. We resonated with the Black Americans that are oppressed, but Black Lives Matter at that point wasn't really a personal thing for us. But as our own movement grew, because there's a social movement that's growing against oppression in the country, somebody nobody knows who, but we suspect it's people in the diaspora who felt for us, coined the Zimbabwean Lives Matter hashtag. And immediately people jumped onto that, because now it was no longer about racism, which is something that's not big in Zimbabwe, but it now resonated with our movement that our lives matter. We are also oppressed. And for once we thought, wow, the world can also see what's going on in Zimbabwe. And that's as far as the two hashtags have been connected to each other. I think there's a sense of solidarity whereby both groups understand that we are oppressed and we live under systems that do not really view our lives as important, regardless of race. So in the Zimbabwean context, I need to stress that it's here we have Black on Black oppression. But this Black on Black oppression is a result of colonial systems that were not, that were never destroyed when independence came. So what happened in Zimbabwe is that we had a racial system of oppression where Black lives did not matter at all in Zimbabwe. When the new government came in place at independence in 1980, instead of dismantling the systems of oppression, they simply stepped into the shoes of the oppressor and they started oppressing Black people. So it's a Black government oppressing Black people, but using the same systems of oppression that racism used.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. I think that's completely what's happened across the entire continent. It's not just Zimbabwe, is that you find colonial systems were maintained and we had the illusion, I call it a hoax, of independence. But it wasn't, independence did not equal decolonization. It was just a replacement of white colonizers with Black ones, you know, and for lots of people, the oppression essentially was continued. And even the laws we live under in Kenya, for example, lots of them were written, you know, during the colonial times. And were actually, some of them, interestingly, were written to stop the Mau Mau struggle, and now are being applied by the government, you know, against Kenyans. It's really a continuation of colonialism. But I just wanted to quickly say one thing about how governments are utilizing this Black Lives Matter movement, moment, to sort of sanitize their own agendas, you know. Firstly, to argue that, look, it happens in the West as well, as if that makes it a good thing, you know. Also, you find them trying to distract. So you'll find the AU, for example, issuing statements about, you know, standing with George Floyd, you know, Black Lives Matter, etc., you know, condemning what the US is doing, but never condemning what African governments are doing. So I think for governments, it's been very easy for them to sort of try and co-opt this entire movement, sort of as geared towards and shining a spotlight on violence in the US, and in a sense, distracting attention from the violence they themselves commit.
So one thing I would like to add to that, because I actually commented that it was ironic that the AU, you know, issued their statement. They'd never seem to have done it when any other examples of oppression or anything like that had happened. But I feel the Black Lives Movement was so huge that, in a way, they could not say anything. This movement seemed to have captured the world's imagination, including Africa, that if you weren't seen to be supporting it or somehow behind it, you know, you were also an oppressor. So I feel that's why, you know, the AU issued their statement. And I think that, you know, so I'm going to your point about, you know, somebody coined the phrase Zimbabwean Lives Matter. I feel it just goes to a point I was trying to make about the success of the movement, that it's become the central force that people can't actually really ignore it. And if you want to have a conversation about oppression, you have got to tag on to something like Black Lives Matter, because it allows you to occupy the spaces where your conversation wouldn't normally get to. And suddenly, and to your point, you know, everybody's sort of like now has noticed, you know, there's issues in Zimbabwe. You know, I hope there's a, you know, Malian Lives Matter. I hope it grows, because there's so many things that happen on this continent that just don't get the bandwidth, they don't get the airtime. And if it takes using the Black Lives Matter hashtag to just give us that opportunity to get into the spaces where it becomes a global issue, then absolutely we should do it.
Fantastic. Thank you for that, Moki. I wanted to pick up on a few themes that all of you raised. When we think about Africa now, you know, the year of Africa, 1960, 60 years on, and this kind of mirror effect that we see. One of the things that I'm really interested in is the theme of struggle in the absence of the struggle being kind of a white supremacist external struggle, but actually an internal struggle against oppression that is actually from the post-colonial governments. And this point that Moki was making about the power of being able to have a kind of a global clarion call to your individual countries. And if you guys could maybe talk a little bit about the resonance of that history for this present moment.
What I realized with this Black Lives Matter movement from the time that it started, I mean, which is years before now, what it symbolized to me was the fact that Black lives have never really been important. I mean, even if we look back all the way up to slavery, you know, slavery was a system of oppression that targeted a race in particular. They came to Africa and they took Black people and enslaved them in a foreign continent, which right now in terms of international law, that would be a crime against humanity. Even when slavery ended, the idea that Black people were not at the same level as white people still was maintained by the same countries that enslaved Black people. But what they then did was come to the continent and subjugate us on home ground, because in their minds that white superiority was never erased, even when slavery was abolished. So it means that what is the oppression of Black people is still the same as it was even during times of slavery, but it keeps evolving with the times to make it a bit more acceptable. So we need a conversation that says, how can we fix this problem of inequality, which is so systemic and so ingrained in all of us, that when these things happen, they happen for long periods of time and people get away with them because, I mean, it's okay. Black people are also okay at times of being servants of white people. And for a long time, Black people are also okay looking up to the West as being saviors that can save us from these Black governments. I think the conversation has to be about equality more than anything.
Patrick, you want to jump in?
I disagree a little bit with what Moki said about it being desirable, this hashtag. Our struggles, when they are sort of put in language that is borrowed from other places, then tend not to reflect what we are fighting for. And sometimes I think they disguise or they hide more than they unite. So in a sense that we think we are fighting the same thing when we actually are probably not. You speak about what was happening in the 60s in the US and the fight for equality there, and the fight for and the anti-colonial war here, you know, the anti-colonial struggle here. Those were similar, but I don't think they were the same thing. And I think when we use language that sort of implies that they are, then we might be missing certain innate and very important differences. So, for example, in the US, you've got a Black minority fighting to be integrated into the United States, to be recognized as equal partners within the United States. But from the perspective of us sitting here on the continent, the United States and the position it occupies across the world is problematic. You know, the fact that the world is ordered in a particular way where majority white countries are at the top and everybody else at the bottom is problematic. So what you're fighting to join is actually inherently oppressive to us. And I think when we say Black Lives Matter as if that reflects us, then somehow we start hiding or distracting from those sorts of differences, which I think are really important to keep in mind. I think our struggles are much better when we start seeing them individually. That's why I'm happy with Zimbabwean Lives Matter, that distinguishes, what they're talking about there.
I know, Moki, you're going to want to respond to this, and let me just add something to it, because I think you can put together Tandakile's comments and Patrick's, right? So we need to strive for equality of race and people. And then it seems to me there's also this challenge of the equality of platforms.
There's just one other thing that I'd wanted to point out, I think Moki should also speak to, and it's the construction of race and the idea of race. Chimamanda wrote that she wasn't Black before she got to America. James Baldwin speaks about the construction even of whiteness in America. These aren't just about skin color. There are things and thoughts that are embedded there.
Just to go to your point, Patrick, about you saying that you disagreed with what I said about Black Lives Matter and that hashtag. I think the point I'm trying to make, and I want to be clear about it, it's not that Zimbabwe Lives Matter or anybody else who uses those hashtags is now buying into the American Black Lives Matter concept. I'm saying that we're using it to occupy that space, to be seen and heard in a way that if we'd had, Zimbabwe is important as a hashtag, maybe just wouldn't have captured the imagination, right? So I think that's the point on that. So I do agree. I think there's a lot of, Tandaka, you were talking a lot about racism and, slavery in the past. And I think, Patrick, your point about how we shouldn't allow ourselves to be, to own, like if I get called Black, it's because somebody else has called me Black, therefore I am Black. I think one of the things that is clear from the work that we are trying to do at Africa No Filter is try to understand what part narrative plays on how Africans see themselves. Because the one clear thing is that as a Zimbabwean or a Nigerian, you probably don't know as much about what an Equatorial Guinean is thinking about, a Gambian is thinking about, an Egyptian is thinking about. You know a lot more about what America is thinking, what Europe is thinking. And the reality is the way we think about ourselves is actually the way the West thinks about us. Because the information I get, ironically, about Mali, about Gambia, about all of these countries, comes from those sources. Because a news editor, for example, in Nairobi does not have a correspondent in Lagos, does not have somebody reporting on news of what's coming out of Mali. They are relying on international wires. And I think just to come back to this thing about the Pan-Africanism movement, I think it's this Pan-Africanism concept, from the 60s doesn't really exist for the man on the street. It comes out every so often, like Africa Day, we all remember, hey, we're all Pan-Africanists, but it doesn't resonate. It tends to resonate when I'm talking in a, like maybe in a forum like this, we're talking to Americans, I'm an African. That's because they see me as an African, but actually I see myself as a Nigerian. And, and I don't, and because that's, and in fact, specifically, I see myself as a Yoruba person. Your average Nigerian Yoruba person doesn't know any more about a Northerner, a Hausa or Fulani in their own country. And I think that's problematic. That really is problematic. And that's something that we as Africans have to sort out ourselves. So when I hear us talking about colonialism and we bring it up in the forums, it's not that it didn't happen. And it's not that we have to get over it. The point is that we just have to figure out what we want to be as Africans. Put my head down now and wait.
No. I agree with you that it's about us figuring out what we want and what we can and cannot be, what are our possibilities. And what I think where that starts is by acknowledging that what we have now, the thoughts we have now, how we consider ourselves now, lots of it is already influenced by what happened during colonialism.
My comment is about the context of Black Lives Matter in Zimbabwe in relation to Zimbabwean Lives Matter. So I feel in the Zimbabwean context, our movement is almost identical to Black Lives Matter because our movement is a cry for help. Zimbabwean Lives Matter is a cry for the international community in particular to see what is happening in Zimbabwe. And it does have a racial connotation to it in the sense that Zimbabweans feel that the international community has completely ignored what is going on in Zimbabwe. And most people feel it's because it's happening in Africa and therefore African lives don't matter, you know, because we've got the United Nations having laws against everything that is happening in Zimbabwe on a daily basis. There is this question in Zimbabwe now that what exactly is the international community and what is their obligation towards each other? And that's why Zimbabwean Lives Matter is not necessarily the hashtag for internal Zimbabweans.
Mm-hmm.
The hashtag for internal Zimbabweans is ZANU-PF Must Go. ZANU-PF, which is the ruling party. So we have our own hashtag that has been trending for so long that says ZANU-PF Must Go. But somebody then noticed there's a problem in Zimbabwe and coined Zimbabwean Lives Matter. So I feel that Zimbabwean Lives Matter is a cry to the world to say, can you not see what's going on in Zimbabwe? And if you can see what's going on in Zimbabwe, what is the obligation of other countries to intervene?
I'd like to broaden it a little bit because everyone in this conversation has a voice and a platform speaking to different audiences. What is our obligations? What are our responsibilities? How do we break through some of the stereotypes and the challenges of a single narrative that think tanks indulge in, that people, US government folks indulge in, and even journalists on the continent? What's the way forward on these issues? I think education is probably one of them, as Patrick said, but what else can we leave our viewers with in terms of where do we go from here?
Well, again, in the Zimbabwe context, the problem is structural, which is what I also think is the problem in America with Black Lives Matter, where the structures that we have in place are structures of oppression that allow for oppression. We have institutions that allow for oppression to take place. So now we're saying, if the world were really serious about this whole concept of globalization and this whole concept of looking out for each other, we would expect that, for starters, maybe the West stops protecting these dictators, because in most cases, even if you look at the wars in DRC and the wars, the West benefits from some of these conflicts. So who is going to stop these people from oppressing us if their oppression is benefiting the international community? So I think we need to have structures in place that actually hold governments to account.
Well, look, I mean, I have to say, I think what you're going through in Zimbabwe, I think is horrific. And I think part of the problem is that it's been there for a while. I'm married to a Zimbabwean, and my in-laws have all hopped over. They're all in South Africa or away from Zimbabwe. But I think the thing is that I have a problem with us looking to the world to come and save us, right? Because I feel that just feeds into that. As Africans, we don't have agency, we can't help ourselves, and we're always looking for help. And that is a narrative that I feel that we have imbibed as Africans, that we can't actually fix things ourselves. Now, you talk about, you wish there was a structure, something in place that could help us, I guess in a way, manage ourselves, manage our politicians better. And I think that organization exists. The AU is there. The fact that it's not working doesn't mean we put our hands up and we go and look for America to help us out. We need to fix our institutions, because we will keep coming back to this place unless we put these institutions in place and we support them to get better at what they do. And we seem to feel that we can't fix things ourselves. And I know I'm sitting in South Africa and it's very easy. You're sitting in Zimbabwe where it feels impossible. And so I want to be clear that I am supporting of what you're saying, but I feel that the long-term implications of us always looking outside means that in 10 years' time, we will be having this conversation. It'll be another country, and we'll be waiting for the world to save us.
Yeah, so Moki, I do agree with you that it is up to us to save ourselves. That's why when Judd was explaining earlier that I said there's already a movement on the ground in Zimbabwe, ZANU-PF Must Go, which is a movement by Zimbabweans to try and free themselves from oppression. So when I say I don't know what the responsibility of the international community is, I'm not just talking about the West, I'm talking even about the African diaspora. the SADC and Cyril Ramaphosa that you're talking about is actually ignoring what's happening in Zimbabwe. They come up with these measures that seem to be interventions, but they are not. So as Africans, even without the West, what is it that we can do to hold these organizations to account and make sure that they're actually working for us?
I think I've got to say that I'm intrinsically suspicious about the idea of African solutions for African problems. I think it's very, very problematic. You know, of course, it implies that somehow African problems are unique. That I think that asking for help is not necessarily a bad thing. I think it's in the context within which we ask that sort of paints whether or not we're exercising our agency. You know, I mean, Europe depends on the US for its security. You don't find them thinking that that somehow diminishes them or their humanity. You know, so I think again, this takes me back to the construction of what African is, and this need that we feel that we've got to show that somehow we are capable. It's not taken for granted that we are, you know. And I think to go to what Judd had asked, for me, the biggest thing would be for people to become suspicious of single stories, of simple explanations. You know, and I think the media does a pretty poor job of explaining things. It's very good at reporting when things are happening, but when it comes to explaining, it's kind of eschews complexity. And we live in a really complex world where certain solutions for certain people don't necessarily work for other people, you know, for other situations, you know. And we've got to learn to be comfortable with complexity, to be comfortable with things that we don't understand and to try and find out.
I just wanted to share with you, Patrick, that, you know, we are recording this 2 days after the coup in Mali. So I've been talking to a lot of media, and every conversation starts with, well, isn't this about the extremism in the North? And this is why the coup happened. And I keep saying that's a factor, but it's actually a much more serious critique about corruption around the system. Right. And don't lead with that element, but that's the single story that the media, particularly in the West, wants to lead with, because that's how they want to frame it. And you're absolutely right. It's really challenging to sort of make sure that they're getting all of it together, and then for myself and for them to admit what we don't know.
Patrick, I actually just want to come back to something you said, which was around, you know, African problems, or you don't like the phrase, it's an African solution to an African problem, because you don't believe there's an African problem. And I think it just goes to also a few other things you said. I feel that you don't like being categorized. You don't like being categorized. Why, you know, that's a very valid thing. And something else that you said is about, you know, there are complexities in the world. We absolutely get that. It is not black or white. You know, Africa is not one story, and neither is the US. But the reality is that the bulk of people think like that. You know, people do think like that. You know, when I think about America, I tend to think about Trump right now. That's what I think about. And I think crazy. That's the single story that comes out to me, because that's what I see and hear constantly. And that's because I watch a lot of CNN. But the reality, that's how I've done it. And the reason why it becomes problematic to us as Africans is because that single story is always in this sort of, you know, it's one of two things. It's the conflict, it's the corruption, it's, you know, it's violence, it's, you know, it's all of these things that ladder up to, we are just a basket case. So for me, I have a problem with that. But it's like this word, which I'm going to say, nigger, depends who says it. You can claim it or you can't. You know, to a white, black person, yeah, well, we've deconstructed it, means nothing to us. And I think that's the way I see these terms, right? Being black, being African. To me, I am black, I am African, I am Nigerian. I have given myself those names, and I have taken ownership of what that means. And I feel that's what we need to do. And the thing about narrative for me, and these, you know, single stories and how media covers, you know, and framing it this way, we have got to do what we can to present new stories, new narratives. And I think, you know, that goes to this point about, you know, what's happening in Zimbabwe, ZANU-PF being an internal message, you know, yes, that's, you know, let's get rid of that party and let's bring in our own system. I feel it shouldn't be a hashtag. It should be a lot more than a hashtag. And I hope you're going to tell me that it is, because a hashtag is about getting awareness and getting people attuned to an issue. And what you are talking about, systemic change in the country, because that's what's allowed ZANU-PF to be in power for so long. There's systemic change that needs to happen. Now, if your brains trust, all your smart Zimbabweans have hopped over the border, they're here, they're in America, they're in Australia, you know, that's a problem. That is a problem, you know. So I feel that there's a lot that we as Africans need to be accountable for. And that's why I feel that, you know, us asking what the world's going to do and, you know, who's going to help us is problematic, because I feel we are very capable.
It's not just a hashtag. So the point of ZANU-PF Must Go came about because the extent of oppression in Zimbabwe is so deep that for anybody to actually voice out to say ZANU-PF must go, it's a dangerous thing to do. But what the movement is trying to do is to get people to say, if you want any change in the country, you have to be able to voice out that the oppressor must go. So when we say ZANU-PF must go, it's a response to the problem that's on the ground. And we realize that in Zimbabwe, you cannot vote them out. So ZANU-PF must go is about a revolution. It's a revolution that is ongoing and that's building momentum, which we hope in the end will lead to an uprising that's going to remove this oppressive government from power. So I actually think it's a work in progress, and the fact that majority of Zimbabweans on social media are now brave enough to actually say ZANU-PF must go is a huge win, because now it means that even off social media, people are starting to have that conversation. Which
thank you for defining yourselves for yourselves and opening up to the broader world all of the nuances and all of the differing perspectives from across the continent, and not just the way that you all see your individual countries, but the way you see your region, the way you see the United States, and the way you see the rest of the world. Because I think that it is a complexity and a nuance that is largely overlooked in the West. Obviously, race has been the elephant in the room in the United States, and the history that has created it and given us all of these identities that have been in some ways foisted upon us, that we have to navigate and then use to try to free ourselves. So thank you all so much for sharing with us so intimately.